Grouping can be a tricky concept for some people, but it unlocks a huge amount of power that you get with SQL and relational databases. Make sure you understand the following video really well, watch it as many times as necessary, practice the exercises as much as necessary, basically get as comfortable as you can with grouping. If you can master grouping, you've mastered one of the two most tricky concepts that SQL offers, but it's an immensely powerful tool in your toolbox. You'll use it over and over again in the future. So what is grouping? When you were using the aggregate functions in the previous video, you were implicitly working with just one group, which was the group of all rows in a table. You can, however, make your own groups as well, and aggregate within those groups. To do that, we use the group by keyword to define a group, and then you can use the having keyword to filter those groups. The easiest way to get your head around this is to look at some examples and talk through them. Let's start with a query that tells us the number of films that we have for each rating. Run that, and we'll bring up the results. What our output is showing us is, for each unique rating that we have in the film table, how many films do we have that rating? So we have 222 PG-13 ratings, 195 R-rated films, 178 G-rated films, and so on. And we did this by introducing this new group by clause, and we said group by rating. When we say group by rating, what we're actually saying here is each group, each unique rating should get its own row in the output. And all subsequent expressions after you introduce group by now operate on groups and not rows. As soon as you introduce the group by clause, your query execution fundamentally changes. And this is where remembering the order of operations becomes important as well. So if you remember, the order is from, where, group by, having, select, order by, limit. So once we get to group by, from, where, group by, if you make use of a group by clause in your query, everything after that, having, select, order by, limit, now operates on groups, not individual rows. What do I mean by that though? Let me introduce another query, and what I'll do is I'll actually execute this query so that its results show in a new tab in the output so that I can jump back and forward quickly. And I'll execute this query so that the results show in a new tab. And so now I have two tabs in the output. This first one comes from the first query. The second tab, the results come from this second query. In case you're wondering how to do that yourself as well, you can see up here in the sidebar, there's an option to execute SQL in a new tab, and I just used the keyboard shortcut, which is Control// on Windows. Okay, so let's talk about our initial query and what happened. We said that we wanted to group by rating. From the order of operations, what came next is the select clause. Select happens after group by. And what we said was that we wanted to select the rating. So after introducing the group by clause, each group gets its own unique row in the output, so it's okay to select the rating, there's just one. And the second thing that we're selecting is a count of all the rows. Jumping over to this second query's results, just to explain things a little bit more visually. What's happened here then, when we've said, okay, we want to group all the G ratings together, is the select clause is now operating on this group of all G ratings. So starting from row 1, going down to row, 178. All of these G ratings that we see here now need to get squashed into simply one row in the output. This is one group, the group of G-rated films. And so when we've used count star here, it's operating on the group. It's saying return a count of how many rows are in this group, which is 178. So jumping back to the results from that query, we see G gets 178. And this happens for every group in our group by clause. So for R-rated films, there are 195. And again, what's happened is all of those R-rated films have been grouped together into a single group to appear as a single row in the output, and that count function is operating on the group now, not the entire table. Let me give you another example where I change count to the sum over all the lengths. Running that. So now for each group, for each unique rating, what I'm doing is summing over all the lengths for those ratings. Let's look what happens now if I maybe try to select the title up here. Running that. I get an error. And the error is the column title must appear in the group by clause or be used in an aggregate function. What does that mean? If you were grouping by title, if you had here group by title, then it would be okay to put title up here in the select clause, because there's one title per group, and after you introduce a group by, each group gets its own row in the output, so it's 1-to-1, and that's fine. However, what we're doing in this query is we're saying group by rating. So what that means is that there are, 178 rows that are associated with, for example, the G rating. If you now say select title, well, what title does that mean? Which of the 178 titles for G-rated films should be picked? Because we're only allowed to have one row in the output for films rated G. It doesn't make sense, because the group is squashing all the films together, and SQL says, hang on, I don't know how to squash together all the titles. You haven't informed me of how I should be squashing all these titles into just one title for that particular group. And so any expressions that appear after you introduce this group by clause have to produce a single result. And that's why aggregate functions work, because aggregate functions are able to squash multiple rows together. They're able to aggregate multiple rows together to produce a single result. And so this is why we can do sum length, and that works fine. Because for each group, for each individual rating, it is possible to sum all the lengths together to produce a single number so that each group just gets one row in the output. So just to repeat this, elements that do not participate in the group by clause are only allowed as inputs to an aggregate function. And that's what the error was telling us. I'll demonstrate now as well an example of grouping by two columns. And for this, I'll use the payment table. So just to refresh your memory of what the payment table looks like. And what I want to achieve now is a query that tells me how many unique interactions between a customer and a particular staff member took place. And I'll use group by to do this. Customer ID and staff ID. And so up in the select clause now, I'm allowed to use those columns that appeared in the group by. And any other element that I introduce in the select clause must produce a single result. So I'll do account. And finally, what I'll do is I'll just order the results as well. Let's run that. Okay, so this tells us the customer with ID 1 interacted with the staff member with ID 1 17 times. The customer with ID 1 interacted with the staff member with ID 2 15 times, and so on. And so here I've grouped by two columns, which says create one row in the output, create one group for every unique combination of customer ID and staff ID. After you've introduced grouping, you can use the having keyword to perform a filter on groups in just the same way that you use the where clause to filter rows. So as an example, let's say I want to return only those customer ID and staff ID combinations where they interacted with each other more than 20 times. I can use having to do that. Having comes after group by, so I'll write having. And again, after you introduce the group by clause, thereafter, everything is working with groups now, not rows. So I can simply say having count star greater than 20. Running that, we can see that that returned only when there were more than 20 interactions between a particular customer and a particular staff member. And I was able to just say having count greater than 20 here because having is already operating in a world where we're talking about groups. Having does not operate on rows, it operates on groups, and it filters groups. It removes groups from the output that don't meet our criteria. A last thing I want to point out is that you can group by expressions as well. Let's imagine that for some reason I wanted to group customers by the first letter of their first name. Bit of a strange one, but whatever. So let's look at the customer table. And what I want to do is say group by left. That's that function that we've now seen a few times. First name 1. So this gets the first character of their first name. So that's what I'm now grouping by. Group by A, B, C, D, and so on. And what I'm going to do is select that same expression so that it shows in my output. And I'm just going to select account again, because that's what I'm interested in. I'm curious how many people are in each group. And I might come back here and just alias this as well. So alias as first letter. And then I'll order by that first letter as well. Let's run that query. And so what this is showing me is that there were 44 customers who have a first name that starts with A, 32 customers that have a first name that starts with B, and so on. So I've introduced an expression, and it's the result of that expression that I'm now grouping by. And those groups, as you see, are pretty much all the letters of the alphabet. And unsurprisingly, there aren't that many customers that have a first name that starts with the letter Z. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, grouping can be a pretty tricky concept, but it's incredibly powerful, and it's a really important tool to have in your toolbox. Play with lots of examples on your own to just get familiar with the idea, and make sure that you do the exercises as well.